Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the webinar. This is about a very important topic, Brexit, and how the latest thinking on Brexit is going to affect everyone. I'd like now to, so if we can move to the next slide, to introduce our three panelists. And we've got three terrific panelists for you today. Naushabah Khan is Director for Public Affairs at 4 Communications. She's a Labour councillor in Medway, and before entering public affairs, she worked for a member of the European Parliament in both Brussels and the UK. She's currently a member of the Labour campaign for the single market. She's appeared on several televised debates and panels discussing Brexit and its economic, social and political implications. So Naushabah will be able to cover very much the latest thinking on the political aspects of Brexit. Richard Bolton is a senior managing consultant at IBM. He's a supply chain professional, so one of you guys with over 20 years experience in industry and consulting. Prior to joining IBM, Richard held senior management roles in electronics manufacturing in the UK and France, with responsibility for operations, supply chain and engineering. In his 10-year career in IBM, Richard has led engagements delivering supply chain transformation, regulatory change and digital strategy to enhance people's customer experience. Our final speaker is Matthew Paul Clark. He's the head of UK Customs, Excise and International Trade at PwC. Matthew leads the Customs, Excise and International Trade team and has specialised in customs and excise duties for 15 years. So he really has some terrific background in the field. Matthew leads PwC's Customs and International Trade Service offerings with respect to Brexit. So he's undertaken over 45 Brexit projects in the last 18 months for PwC's global clients across multiple industries, but most noticeably for automotive, aerospace, electronics and retail. In addition, Matthew has extensive experience of working with clients in the automotive, aerospace, defence, electronics, retail, freight forwarder and technology industries. So a very wide range of experience. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Naushabah.
Hello.
Yep,
Hello,
over
Rod.
to you.
Hi there, apologies. Thank you, Rod. Thanks for the introduction. I think, as you've highlighted, I want to give a bit of the political context to the Brexit debate, because I think particularly on this issue, it plays a fundamental role in the direction that Brexit is going in, and understanding the next steps, the political dynamics, is really fundamental to trying to get our head around what might happen with Brexit. You know, when you look at this, you think, wow, economically, you just never would do this. And that's absolutely right. There are lots and lots of reasons why people wouldn't. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily what's driving this agenda forward. So if we could just move on to the first slide, please. And I will start with just giving a little bit of the background to Brexit. At this stage in time, for those, you know, obviously the UK is due to leave the European Union at 11 o'clock. GMT on Friday, the 29th of March, 2019. It's quick approaching a date that's not very far in the very near future. To provide a bit of a reminder about what's happened, we held a referendum back in 2016. 51.9% of the population decided to vote to leave, with 48.1% voting to remain. Of course, not everybody voted in the referendum, but at the time it felt like that was quite a decisive vote. It certainly reflected quite a divided country, and there was a lot of debate that surrounded this original referendum, lots and lots of concerns around freedom of movement, but also people raising a lot of social concerns that they had about how the UK had changed in the time that we'd been members of the EU, and also the EU's growing involvement within UK affairs. Following that referendum, the UK and the European Union, we triggered Article 50, which essentially put into motion our decision to leave the European Union. That gave us a 2-year period to negotiate and come up with a deal that could work for us as a country. That, I have to say, has gone very, very quickly. And actually, if you've monitored and seen the debates as it's happened, for the first 18 months of that, you could argue that very little was happening, very little was moving forward, and it's only really been in the last sort of 6 to 8 months that we've seen some progression on this. There was clearly a lot of domestic concerns politically, but also with the European Union. There were some real struggles in finding a way to decide what Brexit could look like. And to be honest, we haven't really progressed too far forward on some of this. So over a year has been trying to come up with our withdrawal plan. A rough outline has now been agreed on how future outlines might work. And that includes a political declaration. The political declaration simply sets out the commitment that the European Union has and that the UK has to continuing to work together after Brexit comes into force. That agreement was largely negotiated by Theresa May at the front foot and the UK government, and it was taken to her cabinet a few weeks ago. That then caused a bit of political fallout, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the next step is that the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration will now have to become a bill that goes through our own parliament and will go to a vote in the European Parliament itself. Moving on to the next slide, please. Sorry, just move on to the next slide, please. So the proposed withdrawal deal. This is Theresa May's. This has been the result of Theresa May's discussion with the European Union. It sets out quite a few key areas, which we will probably explore later on in this webinar, but it includes a commitment to citizens' rights. So that means all of those EU citizens currently living in the UK will be able to stay. There's approximately 3 million, and equally those who are currently living, UK citizens currently living in the European Union will be able to stay. And that also includes security for their family, which is set out in European law. So even if your family isn't living with you at the moment, within the rules of the withdrawal deal, they will be able to come and join you in whichever country of residence you are in. The deal also talks in some detail about the goods that are placed on the market before we leave the European Union and also during the transition period, and how during the transition period, those goods will still be able to enjoy the freedom of movement that the EU, our membership of the European Union allows for it to do so. Probably the biggest part of this withdrawal bill is the transition period, which is agreed within it, which will take us to the 31st of December 2019, which is when we will actually finally leave, but it allows for flexibility. It allows for us as a country to continue enjoying the rights of being members of the single market and the customs union during that period. And most of all, it gives businesses the support that they need to be able to operate within and know what it will look like after March the 29th, when we are technically meant to leave the European Union. It allows for us to flow into a transition period. And during that period, you could argue that not a huge amount will change immediately if this withdrawal bill is agreed. One of the other key fundamental elements of the negotiations has been with the Irish border. That's often been the sticking point on a lot of these negotiations, given the political and historical issues that exist around the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It's a huge problem for the UK if that were to go backwards in any way, or for the Good Friday Agreement, which dealt with that particular issue, to fall. So it's been a bit of a chain on Theresa May, really, to be able to find something that both satisfies that, but also is able to satisfy the Brexiteers within her own party and within the wider Parliament. So that's been a huge issue. And what's agreed in this withdrawal bill is a backstop. We will, I'm sure, talk about that in a bit more detail in a bit, but it does allow for, if no deal is ever met, the Irish backstop will come into play, which will protect which will avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So that has been a fundamental part of the withdrawal agreement, which Theresa May has been negotiating. And the whole point of the withdrawal deal is that during the transition period, the EU and the UK then look to arrange some form of trade agreement that will come into place once the transition period is over, so that they can take things forward. To move on to the next slide, please. So as we talked about, this withdrawal agreement that Theresa May has drafted has not been without drama. Following the announcement that this is what it's going to look like, she faced a lot of challenge within her own party. There were a number of Brexit MPs and Tory backbenchers who said they were going to quit or leave or just didn't back her. She had to replace her Brexit secretary. We seem to be replacing Brexit secretaries on a regular basis. There's a real lack of stability within the government on this issue, and our new Brexit secretary is Stephen Barclay, again, someone who voted to leave the European Union himself. But equally, not only the Brexiteers have been against the deal, but Remainers have actually said that this is not a good deal. It's not something that they want. And opposition parties, both the DUP from Northern Ireland and the UK Labour Party, have said, actually, we cannot support this deal. So you could argue, not quite sure who is going to support it, if neither the opposition and those Remainers or the hardline Brexiteers are going to support it. So that's left Theresa May in a very difficult position, but she has reasserted that this is what she's going to go forward with, and it's the deal that she's taken forward to the European Union and will be bringing back to the UK Parliament in December. So what happens next? Well, there are a number of scenarios that we could now face now that we have the bare bones of our deal together. As I said, the next step really, this deal has just gone to, following an emergency summit, to the European Union with the 27 member states voted. It required a supermajority, which it received. So it has, in principle, been accepted by them. The next step of that process is to bring it back to the UK Parliament. That vote on the bill, on the deal, will be on the 11th of December, and that will follow about 5 days of debate, which will start on the 4th of December. So it's going to be quite an intense period of time. If that deal is rejected by the UK Parliament, then we are in some interesting territory. But if it is rejected, then the UK Parliament and the government have 21 days to make a statement. Their statement has to say what they're going to do next and how they wish to proceed. They can come back to the Parliament with a slightly amended version of a deal and see if that is more palatable to the UK Parliament. So there could be a second vote on a slightly amended version of this deal, which is looking a more and more likely scenario, given that so many people are objecting to it now. But what the result of it could mean is that once we see the political fallout, the economic fallout, the social fallout, we may well see the government say, okay, look, we've tweaked it slightly and we've come back with something a bit different. Let's vote for this. Let's get behind this. Otherwise, we are going to face economic turmoil in this country. So that's a very likely scenario. The other option is that if the deal falls, we could ask the EU to extend Article 50 in order to allow the UK more time to come up with something different. There isn't a huge amount of political will for this option. And actually, you could argue, what will it really achieve, given that the Prime Minister has tried very, very hard to already come up with something that satisfies everyone. And she's in a very difficult position because it is almost an impossible task. So I don't think it's necessarily likely that this will happen, but it is a possibility that we could ask for an extension on Article 50 and carry on pushing this issue further down the line. There is, of course, the internal challenges. So if the deal falls in Parliament, Theresa May well have a leadership challenge from her own party. That hasn't been possible in the last few weeks. Jacob Rees-Mogg, one of the leading Brexit MPs, has already tried to submit a vote of no confidence in her, but that didn't get any traction. And actually, he has failed to get 48 other MPs to join him, because I think there is a distinct realization that this is a tough job and nobody really wants to take it on at this stage. However, if the deal falls in Parliament, then there may be some appetite, and there may be some stronger appetite to see a new leader in place with the idea that they might be able to do a different or a better job. And then there is, of course, the opposition parties who are suggesting that in those circumstances, we would push potentially for a general election, or push for a people's vote on the final deal, or the option of having no deal whatsoever, so that we go back to the public and say, look, we've tried our hardest with this. These are all the different options that we've come up with. We can't really get behind anything. There is no agreement from the UK Parliament on this, but what do you think? We want to ask you finally, is this what you really want? And that was something that possibly about 8 months ago would never have happened. It's starting to grow a little bit in terms of appetite and people's desire to see a potential second vote on this issue. Of course, the other final scenario really is, if all of this fails, is the no deal scenario, which again 3 months ago seemed really likely. Hopefully we started to move away from it because government realised that realistically it's just the worst case scenario that we shouldn't be going towards. However, again, if all of this does fail and nothing changes, then that is the situation that we are moving towards. Next slide, please. So here I've just detailed some of that timeline that I've talked through already. We've had the emergency summit with the European Union. A supermajority was reached. As I said, that debate in Parliament will start on the 4th of December with what is known as a meaningful vote taking place on the 11th of December. If that vote does pass, we've talked a bit about what happens if it doesn't, but if it does pass, then a new bill will come forward in sort of early 2019, January, February time next year, which will really make this into a bill that can then pass through the parliamentary processes of the UK Parliament. That bill will then need to be ratified by the European Union on the 29th of March, and that is when we will officially leave the European Union, and the transition period will start on the 30th of March 2019, with a plan for it to end on the 31st of December 2020, at which point the idea is that the UK and the EU will have agreed for a trade agreement that can replace the transition and some of the rules and regulations that were in place as we were members of the European Union, and it will set out how we will work together. So that's a rough timeline of what will happen if this bill passes. Can we move to the next slide, please? So I suppose one of the big questions is really what happens after the 29th of March when we enter that transition period. And for businesses, this is really the key, because this is about knowing how to plan for it, what you do when that happens, and it's about ensuring that you're as prepared for it as you can possibly be. One of the problems has been that with all the political fallout, it's very, very difficult, and I'm sure everybody on the call will be able to feed into this themselves, but it's very, very difficult to plan. And that is completely understandable given how volatile the situation has been. So really here, I've just tried to set out two possible scenarios, and I know that my other panelists will explore them in further detail. But if the withdrawal deal passes on the 29th of March, then we enter that transition period. As I said, the EU law continues to apply to the UK as if it was a member state. However, critically, the UK can no longer take part in any discussions or making of those rules within the European Union. So we still have to abide by them, but we no longer have any say in what they look like and no ability to shape them. That's upset a few Brexiteers, but ultimately the transition period really is there to safeguard business and ensure that there is no cliff edge when it comes to Brexit. There is a lot of detail within the withdrawal deal about what happens to goods that are placed on the market, either immediately before the transition period or during. Again, the real consensus here is that they will be able to circulate freely and to be able to enjoy the same rules and regulations that they were privy to prior to Brexit happening. The only exceptions to this, well, one of the exceptions to this are animal goods and animal products and live animals themselves, because they will have to they will face other custom checks and I will allow other panelists to explore that in further detail, but there will be some changes around that particular area of transport. The UK will be able to continue to participate in the single market and in the customs union during that period of transition, and they'll also be able to, which will mean that freedom of movement, which has always been one of the most contentious points around Brexit, will still be allowed during that transition period as well, as it is a fundamental principle of our involvement within the single market. The other thing with the transition period, and something which has been talked about quite a bit, is that there is a possibility to extend it. So although technically it is there in place until the end of 2020, there is potential to make it go out a bit longer. However, what we've got to be really careful about on this, and perhaps a lesson to be learned from some of the negotiations we've already seen in the last 2 years, is that that time goes by very, very quickly. And during that time, the UK and the EU will have to be finalising what will look like the formation of a trade agreement. And as businesses, those two years cannot be used complacently, or 21 months as it is approximately. They have to be used to plan, to think ahead and work out what happens next. Because time goes very, very quickly and things can change very, very quickly. And as much as on paper it looks like everything will go on as usual, we know that the reality of it means that certainly there will be some challenges that are presented even during the transition period itself. Move on to the next slide, please. The other option, however, that is that if this deal does not pass, then we are potentially into a no-deal scenario. And this really is worst case scenario, but the fact is that over time the government have started to make it, they've presented papers on it, they've talked about it more and more. It has gone from being something that was considered to be a complete no-go area to something which may well still happen. And a no-deal scenario poses a lot of challenges because it does not allow for a transition period. And that is a huge, huge problem. That means on the 29th of March, we leave the European Union and the next day everything changes. Now, the idea is that we would then revert to WTO rules. However, that in itself presents a whole new range of challenges for business. It means that the discussions that have come through government so far have suggested that those changes would happen almost immediately. So you could look at major impacts on our ports, major impacts at our airports. The transfer of goods would become very, very difficult, and services. Customs arrangements would have to be put into place very quickly. That's something that the UK has not really been planning for in any practical terms, certainly not in any way that it should be if we were to be facing a no-deal scenario. Again, significant economic impacts on both our currency and other elements of our economy would be hugely impacted by a no-deal scenario, and it is something that government wants to avoid. But if a deal cannot be put forward that's not palatable, then that's the situation that you could potentially face. The Treasury have modelled what a no-deal scenario, the potential impact it could have on the UK. Now, of course, no one knows this for certain, but their rough modelling has suggested that you could be looking at 820,000 out of a job within 2 years, the pound to fall, the sterling to fall by 15%, and inflation to rise by 2.7%. So it is something that the government wish to avoid. It is something that I'm sure businesses wish to avoid, but equally, you have to continually think, how can we be best prepared for even this scenario, which is the worst case scenario, where it's better to be prepared for this than to be caught unawares. And that, you may move to the next slide, that is the end of my very quick introduction into some of the politics behind what is happening on Brexit.
Naushabah, thank you very much for a great introduction politically. We're now going to hand over to Richard, who's going to talk us through some of the business implications of what's happening at the moment. So Richard, over to you. Carly, if you want to move on to the next slide.
Thank you, Rod, and good afternoon all. So what I want to cover this afternoon briefly is really three topics. Firstly, the impact of uncertainty. Secondly, the market activities and the actions that we're seeing companies taking at the moment. And thirdly, the key themes that are running in Brexit preparation and we're seeing around UK industry. Now, for those of you who attended the Brexit preparation roundtable back in September, I put forward a statistic that showed that as of May this year, in a Harvard Business Review survey of the leaders of UK industry and C-suite officials, 50% of them hadn't started preparing for Brexit. Now that changed, and we knew that was changing. In a recent survey in September by the EEF, the Engineering Employers Federation of Manufacturing Companies, showed that at that stage, 83% of their respondents were preparing for a hard Brexit. Now, what's interesting is 83% were not preparing for a no deal. So therefore, industry was starting to think very heavily about a hard Brexit, but not about no deal. And as Naushabah has just shown us, no deal is still seen as a politically viable option, but it does have some very, very serious ramifications. So when we look at the impact of uncertainty, I want to look at this really in four areas that is already having an impact on businesses and is likely to continue. So firstly, we see that 11% of the UK manufacturing workforce are EU nationals at the moment. Now, using manufacturing as the example here, that figure changes in other industries. In haulage, for example, it's far higher. That is a potential loss to the UK workforce of skilled individuals in a number of fields, should there be a hard Brexit. Now, that could be either as a ramification of changes to regulations and their ability to stay, yes or no, if we don't go into some form of deal. It could equally be an economic impact with the fall of the pound, meaning that their earnings that they're sending back home are falling in value. That's an economic reason that is likely to take people out of the UK. So manufacturing industry will be hit hard, and industry as a whole will be hit, particularly in areas such as transport and other semi-skilled areas. Looking then at the value of exports, and particularly what's going to happen to UK companies exporting. Back in 2016, 52% of UK manufacturing exports went to the EU. So the EU is a significant market. Risk of going to WTO rules on the 29th of March next year is extreme. It's extreme in the sense that the prices will change, the cost of the goods will change, the ability of the customers in the EU to use those goods will change. Their likelihood to start seeking other sources, at least in the short to medium term, is high, and that will put a large disruption upon companies. Now, with that, also that 52% of manufacturing exports going there, we have seen over the last 12 months a decline in UK manufacturing output. It hit a 10-year high in November 2017. As Naushabah said, the first 12 to 18 months of the Brexit time period post-referendum were quite quiet. Things have accelerated since, and we've seen that certainly in a negative sense with the UK manufacturing output dropping in that period, and it's been dropping steadily over the last year. Now, the EEF survey that I referred to regarding the preparation for Brexit also had an impact. In the same survey, they found that 1 in 6 of our manufacturing companies report that business will become untenable if the UK reverts to WTO tariffs. So that untenability is coming from a number of areas. It's coming from the complexity of regulation that will follow. It's coming from the additional administrative overhead that will be required. It's coming from the regulatory requirements of customers of theirs outside the UK, and the need for their customers outside the UK, for the UK then to meet new regulations. We're no longer part of the EU regulatory network. So a significant degree of complexity is likely to drive companies to cease trading or fold voluntarily or look to move into different areas. So again, a significant impact there, and we're already starting to see companies considering relocation at the moment, some vocally and talking about it, and others, particularly in small manufacturing areas, starting to move their manufacturing overseas. And finally, a figure from the UK automotive industry is that's an industry that's been particularly vocal about Brexit and the risk of a no-deal Brexit recently, and has been pushing hard and lobbying quite seriously with the government to really make their voice heard and make it clear to the politicians that there will be impact within their constituencies if they are MPs for factories, for companies where they have factories within that constituency, or likewise if they have supply chain elements of the supply chain in their constituencies, that their investment has fallen considerably in 2018. The automotive industry is not carrying on its investment in the UK, which will ultimately have an impact in jobs, ultimately have an impact in our viability as an automotive manufacturer. In our high-end manufacturing business is one of the core elements of UK skills outside of the service sector. And to see that investment falling in the automotive industry is rather a harbinger of doom that's likely to ripple through the rest of the supply chain. So Kylie, if I could ask you to step on a slide, please. And we'll look at the market activities. So this is, the 4 main activities that we're seeing companies start to take in preparation for Brexit. Now, it has to be said, these are mitigating actions being taken in preparation for potentially a hard Brexit, but more likely a no-deal Brexit. And that a hard Brexit will still give a 20-month or 21-month adaptation period through the transition. So there are, we are seeing auto manufacturers, as an example, prepare to automate and enable customs across the borders. So an expectation they will have to trade across borders and transact across borders come the 29th of March next year, and put those capabilities in place. And Matthew will talk more about that later. Eurus, which is a very large umbrella organisation for trade bodies, a survey of theirs showed that a third of their members have changed or are thinking of changing suppliers, primarily if we're looking at the origin of goods, particularly within the EU, where when they're exporting outside of the EU, if there's a risk to the origin of their goods based on the UK element, they will have to look at potential new supply options. And likewise, manufacturers in the UK may be relooking at their supply chain, particularly to ensure that their product is ultimately of UK origin. There have been loud noises made by car companies about suspending production. Now, part of this is annual shutdowns anyway that would take place, but are being moved into the start of April to give the car companies, BMW being a prime example, that opportunity to see what is happening around them and to take stock, and to consider how they will then deal with disruptions in the supply chain should those disruptions arrive. Now, I mentioned briefly about relocating of operations, and there's been some noise made by both Airbus and also by BMW about potentially relocating outside of the UK. Now, these companies would be re-evaluating their products on a 3 or 5 yearly basis anyway, and would be reassessing their manufacturing options. We know that the car industry has plenty of capacity around Europe, so they would be looking at that regardless. Now, there may be reasons to stay in the UK should it become more economically advantageous in the future. However, there are some very loud noises being made to try and put pressure on the government to move away from no-deal scenario, particularly about taking jobs out of the UK and back into mainland Europe for the manufacture of Mini, for example. And fourthly, companies are looking at stockpiling inventory. Now, the one piece of good news that comes in all of this is that Mondelez, the owner of Cadbury's, are stockpiling chocolate and biscuit ingredients ahead to maintain production. So we can be confident moving into April and Q2 next year that there should be chocolate on our shelves that we can eat, and biscuits to keep us well fed. So that's a small piece of good news there. However, that rather covers up the larger issue behind that around stockpiling. Now, the BBC estimates that in Q1 next year, UK industry will build up £40 billion worth of stockpiled inventory in preparation for disruption to just-in-time supply chains come the 29th of March. Now, in that case, that's likely to put pressure on companies in the first part of next year, the first quarter. As demand increases, we see a spike in demand, a slightly unnatural spike in demand, and subsequently potentially a mini recession as we move into Q2 of next year as the stockpiles are burned up. So we're likely to see a bullwhip effect of sorts on supply chains next year, and significant strain on inventory, on cash flows, and on storage in the first quarter of next year. Now, to give some context behind the storage capability or the warehousing capability in the UK, there is 6% spare capacity, according to Savills, the estate agents and real estate firm, in a recent survey. So there's very little spare warehousing capability for companies to take advantage of them at the moment. So even should they decide to stockpile and they have the depth of pockets and the cash flow to allow them to do that, the risk then comes from having the correct locations and the viable locations in which to store those goods. So there is a significant impact to stockpiling, though we are seeing it, and particularly in the aerospace industry, the large players, the OEMs, are driving their suppliers to hold inventory and to be prepared to ride out the month of April, at the very least, with disruptions in the supply chain, whilst they determine what's happening and what the future of just-in-time looks like under the new scenario. So, Carly, if I could ask you to step on one, please. And so, thirdly, I want to look at the key themes behind this. So what are the themes behind these uncertainties and these disruptions in the market activities? So firstly is the customer demand, and in B2B scenarios, the business customers are driving inventory holdings, as we see in some industries, and that will require short-term flexibility from suppliers, from manufacturing companies and distribution companies, to be able to deal with an increased demand in quarter one, but then a fall in demand likely in quarter two, as well as a potential for regulatory and funding driving multinationals to the EU and driving them to source their goods in the EU. Pricing, we see a potential increased costs coming from the cost, not only the administration of moving goods across borders, but also the physical cost of the duties that have to be paid, and therefore that will drive companies to reevaluate pricing strategy and the complexities that go with that, decisions to be made on how to price goods with additional costs to them, and also and market behavior behind that. There may be advantages for some companies here and opportunities for big players to perhaps try and steal market share if they've got the deeper pockets, but equally within that will be a whole review of markets and the pricing and how to respond to a change in the cost of importing goods into the UK. Thirdly, looking at continuity of operations. So firstly, as I mentioned, the risk of the loss of skilled staff could result in a sudden outflow of labour, and the capability of companies to act, that they have the staff to carry on their operations, and also within the back-end IT systems of which companies find essential and on which they're built, large volumes of data being used and large new processes to handle customs movements and other tracking of movements of goods is likely to put strain on systems as well, and will require analysis of business resiliency and understanding of how to deal with that. And fourthly, and I put this one last so that I think it gives the best lead into Matthew's presentation next, is delays at the border are likely to require changes to inventory policies and potential new partners, as companies need to use partners in the customs field and the shipping field to be able to provide them the agency they need and the skills they need to bring goods across the borders, as that demand, that skill set, which has been dwindling in the UK over recent years, as the fall in the need for customs agencies and customs capability has dropped with the trade with the EU, those skills are now going to be required again, and it's likely that many companies will need to partner in those areas, and those partners could be in short supply. So let me use that as a natural end to what I'm saying. I will be delighted to answer questions later, but let me hand over now to Matthew to carry on and look at the customs and excise impact of Brexit.
So Richard, great overview. Matthew's now going to be, as Richard said, dealing with the customs and excise implications. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Todd. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm just going to take you through some of the customs and international trade points of Brexit. So if we could just move on to the next slide, Charlie. So really, the questions that we need to ask ourselves as a business is, let's keep up to date with the negotiations. Let's understand what the options are. And I think Naushabah's done a really good job of kind of laying those out. So do we think we're going to have a deal? Are we going to move into this transition period, or is a no deal still on the table? I think, that there's an equally good chance of both at the moment, but you've got to kind of keep abreast of where you are on a daily basis to understand how those political sides will affect the trade side. And it might be, before Christmas, we have a really good indication to kind of understand, does it look like that no deal potential at the 29th of March is actually increasing or not? And Rich has gone through and given a really good explanation of, when will the uncertainty end? And that's one of the main problems with Brexit for businesses. Well, how do we plan? We just don't know changes from day to day, and some businesses are really struggling with direction, and we can talk about that a little bit in a moment. And that leads you on to, well, what is your plan? And I think most businesses now are starting to realise that they do indeed need a plan, and that plan needs to take into account the different options of how we move forward. Do we move into a transition agreement? What does the future end state model look like? And what does a no deal do for us? And how can we be ready for each of those? And I think it's quite interesting because as the introduction that was given on me, we've been working on Brexit projects for quite some time now, since the vote went through. But historically, the work that we were doing was really to help our clients understand what's the impact of Brexit in pounds and pence on their supply chain. So how much would the extra duty cost? What does the cash flow input look like on the VAT? How much in extra customs declarations could there potentially be on movements between the UK and the EU and vice versa? So it was really kind of that let's see how much it affects our landed cost on our goods. What's the cost of our supply chains? But I think, as the other presenters have said, it's kind of that has shifted over time. And certainly over the summer, where you start to have very clear messages from the government, from HMRC and industry bodies like the CBI saying, you've got to actually prepare for a hard Brexit now. You may understand what your risks are. You might have done those initial data analysis on the costing implications on your supply chains, but start to actually take action and move towards preparing your business. And that's really what I want to go over on the next couple of slides. So if we could just move over on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what are we looking at the moment? And I think the two main things on the table are we've got a no deal, and we move to the World Trade Organization rules, or we've got a deal, and that deal, bearing in mind, is an exit deal or a divorce deal from the EU that may lead to a new economic and security partnership with them. So if we have a no deal, what does that actually mean? Well, as we said before, that means on the 29th of March, the world ceases to trade as we know it between the UK and the EU. It's just that big of a change. An international border goes in place. All goods moving across that border are subject to customs duty, and some of them might be at a zero rate, some of them can be as high as kind of 20, 25, especially if you start to get into the types of products that are either have specific rates based on volumes or weight, or use immersing tables like for food ingredients, when you look at the different components within the food, can push up the rates to be quite high. At the moment, we understand that HMRC and the EU have kind of said that on both sides, we expect that the tariffs to remain the same, so business has some certainty in the event of a no deal. But then that has slightly shifted to, but we might make some changes in agricultural, animal products and fishing products. So again, you've got that slight move away from the promises that we were kind of hearing 6-8 months ago, that those tariffs will remain the same across the UK-EU potential border as they would as if, say, you were importing goods from a third country like the US into the UK. You're also going to have the introduction of intrusive border checks. Now, on the UK side, they said that they want to keep the borders moving as fast as possible. And obviously what they're worried about is the ports on the eastern side of the UK that predominantly roll-on, roll-off based or channel tunnel. And for clients and businesses using those, there is going to be disruption, I think, certainly on the European side, which I hate to say, but I think there's less preparation gone in on that side than there has in the UK. But certainly on the UK side, they want to keep these borders moving and the clearance is happening on a regular basis. So they're saying that they're going to create 2 inland clearance depots, one near Milton Keynes, one near Heathrow, that if there are goods that need further inspection because they're deemed as high risk, or you turn up to the border and you don't have the paperwork completed correctly because customs data is key to fill out customs declarations, or perhaps you don't have certificates. So, for example, veterinary certificates for plant products or animal products, or an import license for a pharmaceutical or a medical product. If those things aren't at the border and they need to require to check you, your goods are likely to move to these two inland clearance depots where they'll be liable to further checks, and then they will be able to be cleared into the UK market. That will eliminate some of the disruption at the port border or the Channel Tunnel itself, but it does mean that you get to then further to almost a second stage of clearance, which will make your supply chain far lengthier in terms of clearance. So you've got these border checks. We've also said that duties will come up, so you've got the tariffs applicable. From an import VAT perspective, HMRC and the government have said we will not be burdening UK business with import VAT for UK EU movements. So we're going to move something more akin to an Article 23 license, which is used by the Dutch, excuse me, which means that you account for VAT through your VAT return, but you don't actually physically pay it over and have to recover it. So there is a cash flow advantage on that. So that's the main things from a no-deal perspective. You've also got to think about the cost to your customs declarations and how much you're going to pay your freight agents, customs clearance agents, to actually submit those declarations on your behalf, and they can be anywhere from £15 up to £100, depending on the complexity of that actual declaration. So thinking about that, sometimes, and for some companies, if they have lots of movements across the border in small parcels, the actual customs administration costs can be more than the actual taxes that could be applicable in a no-deal scenario. So that's something to really think about. So let's move on to we move into a transition. What does that kind of look like through to December 2020? Well, we've got a customs union still and a common rule book, but I think something that Naushabah said earlier is really important. We seek to have that voice in terms of the policies that are then being given to us. So HMRC officials will no longer sit within the technical committees for customs duty, so they won't be able to influence classification decisions on how goods are classified and what tariff rates are applicable, the valuation committee on how to value goods being imported, and the different policies that apply to that. So we are kind of rule takers at that point, and we just have to accept what the EU gives us during that period, and that's not sitting well with an awful lot of business. There's reduced market access in terms of services and trade. There is an end of free movement, which again is something that heavily played in the Brexit debate. So it's, that's what a lot of people are going to be happy with. And there is a level playing field in terms of lots of the different regulatory side of things, and we will continue to participate in some EU programs. But remembering this is just this kind of interim period of time. And I think one thing that does look a little bit different is there was a note in the 585-page exit deal. I'm sure you've all read it. It was a fantastic read on Wednesday night last week. But there's a movement certificate that's being introduced that people moving goods across the border will have to either say that these goods have been imported into the UK and have had customs duty paid, so they're in free circulation in the UK, or that they are of UK origin, and therefore when they pass across the border, they should be treated as being within the customs union. And that is something that is a difference to today. We don't have an awful lot of details on that at the moment. There's been no specimen documents or exactly how the transmission and submission of that particular movement certificate is going to work. Is it something that you've got to do before the goods move? Is it something that you just need to have in place afterwards? Do you have to submit it through a Chamber of Commerce or HMRC? At the moment, that's still a little bit up in the air, and that's something that will develop. So even in this interim period, there are some changes that are going to be made. So what do we think we'll finally move to as an end state model? Well, at this point, who knows? And what will that actually look like? As we said before, by the end of 2020, we could move into a new economic partnership. The likes of the political paper has put forward a think you've still got the option of a high alignment deal, something akin to checkers, but both sides, I think, are coming to understand that that is not a feasible solution. The EU certainly has pushed back quite heavily on that, which means that staying within the customs union long term, I think, would be quite a difficult proposition to entail, without us basically accepting a lot of the EU's demands, being governed by them, the ECJ still having jurisdiction, not having the chance to do our own international trade deals, which is a lot of the point of the whole Brexit in the first place. So then what's the most likely or more likely scenario? We think it's probably going to be something like a free trade deal, with everyone talks about the Canadian deal, CETA, and building on that. Now, that would mean that the international borders are still in place, but goods and regulation on both sides should be still the same or aligned, which means that the border crossing should, in theory, be a lot quicker than if we move to WTO rules. We can then have a free trade agreement, which means that goods that are wholly made or originate, come out the ground or the fish in UK or EU territories would move across the border free of customs duty. And in goods that are manufactured with predominantly UK, EU raw materials parts, again, could benefit from that and pass across free of duty, which would be kind of a good halfway house. The other good thing about that free trade agreement scenario is it then allows us to go out into the world and negotiate our own free trade agreements with the rest of the world outside of the EU, which is something that we wouldn't be able to do if we stayed within the customs union. So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so this slide, I appreciate it might be difficult to look at all the detail in this, but it's just kind of going through some of the scenarios in terms of the exit treaty and the trade deal, and the disruption potential in there and what we could end up with. So I think the slides are going to be shared afterwards, so I'll kind of let you have a look at that after the webinar. But it just suffices to say that there's an awful lot that could happen, that even if we have this trade deal, that we move into this interim period of time, which is through the exit or divorce deal, if that's an easier way to call it. That doesn't necessarily mean that at the end of that 2-year period, or even if it's extended, that we move into something that we really want. So whether that looks like a high alignment deal like Chequers, a low alignment deal like a free trade agreement like a Canada type plus agreement, or even a no deal at that point. But there's still an awful lot to play for during that transition period, and that is almost where some of the real negotiation that should have happened over the last 2 years will actually need to take place, because you've really got to iron out the detail at that point when we come to the end of that period of time, and that is just what that slide is actually reflecting. So if we can move on to the next slide. So what are businesses doing, and what should you focus your efforts on? So I've tried to keep this really, really simple here. So the first thing is obviously trade and customs, in terms of if the worst came to happen, and on the 29th of March we did leave the EU, are you going to be ready to move your goods the next day? So the question is, have you got all the data that you need to put on a customs declaration? Do you have the right certificates and checks in place for the goods to physically cross the border? So those health certificates, for plants, meat products, things like that, import licenses for medical pharma products, all that. Do you have the information? Do you have the right certificates? And also, what is your time frame for getting that information and those certificates either to your logistics agent that's physically moving your goods, or to your customs broker that has to present that information on your behalf at the border, both at point of export. So if it's leaving the UK into the EU, to the UK authorities to start because of moving at export when they get to the port or the Channel Tunnel, or on the import side into the EU when it goes to the EU customs authorities at the point of import. And that's something to really, really focus on. Because if there's anything that I've found over the projects that we've been doing with business, it's that at the moment, all this data requirements for customs declarations and import certificates and health certificates, you have so much time to pull all that information and certificates and supporting documentation together because typically you're working with goods that are arriving by sea freight that take weeks to get here. If you look at the UK-EU dynamic from a logistics perspective, then you can have things moving from one to the other in 4 to 6 hours. And that's how fast this information has got to be in place and with the requisite parties to clear your goods. Also, understanding how much customs duty and import that, which is still going to be applicable moving goods out of the UK into Europe, is going to cost you from a cash flow perspective. How does that affect your pricing? Talking to your customers, talking to your sister entities on what the supply chain looks like. Who is going to suffer the cost at both ends? Who is going to physically do the declaration at both ends of these supply chains? All that is absolutely key. And having those conversations as early as possible is really important. Also, if you get past that point and you've done the minimum work that you can, you're going to start to look at how can we strategically better ourselves or give ourselves an advantage. So could I use customs warehousing? Could I use inward processing if I'm making goods, bringing materials in and shipping them back, finished products back across the border? They're approvals that you can get from HMRC, but they take time to get them. So again, having all those things prepared, understanding what release may apply and starting to get them in place will be key. Authorised economic operator, which is a trusted trader approval. At the moment, we're unsure whether that's going to get you something or nothing at the border. It could be the difference between your goods moving really quickly, or HMRC might decide that it's not going to influence them too much. We don't know, but again, can you take the risk of not having it if it is a differentiation factor for goods clearing faster through a potential border? I'm not going to spend much time on the other two things because I think some of the others have mentioned that. I think Richard did. The people on the immigration side, knowing who makes up your workforce. Do you have any new nationals in strategic key positions within your workforce? Do they know what their options are, what they need to do to register, to stay, to move, how all that is potentially going to affect them? And then the strategy and regulation. What does it look like for a no deal? What does it then look 2 years after that? What does it look like for an interim deal? And I think moving to an interim deal is where we all hope we're going to end up. But what I would say is kind of a closing note for my section is the types of change projects that are required for Brexit are moving even to a free trade agreement or a no deal scenario, whether it's next March or in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. Some of these change projects to change your supply chains, to change your computer systems, to change your supply contracts take an awful lot of time. So what I would say is we might be able to take our foot a little bit off the gas if we go into an interim deal, but I wouldn't stop your preparations for Brexit. They need to continue so you can ensure your business is ready for whatever that end state model looks like. So I think that's me in terms of my slides. Rod, I'll pass back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. And we're running a bit long on time, but I do have a number of questions. And the first question I have is about HMRC. How prepared are HMRC and indeed the European authorities for a hard Brexit? Do they have any new systems in place or planned? And is that something that can help my business with a hard Brexit? So Matthew, I don't know whether you want to pick up on that one.
I'll take that one first. So HMRC historically were going to put in a new import and export clearance system called CDS, which replaces Chief, which is akin to changing for a Commodore 64 with black screen and kind of the moving green cursor almost to an iPad. It will put data analytics at their fingertips in terms of the officers, and it will also ease some clearances at the border. The problem is that was originally thought of that it was going to be ready for November. It now looks like half of the system will be ready, say, for imports within the first quarter next year, but only some of the key testers of those systems, so the really big importers in the UK, will use it in the first instance. Over time, the rest of the UK will move over to CDS, but I think it is going to be a transition over time, and it's not going to be in place certainly with full functionality, certainly by the March date. So I think there are systems that are put in place. I think HMRC have done a fair bit of prep, or as much as they can. They've released a lot of papers on what you're going to do in the event of a no deal. They are thinking about the ports and the airports on the East Coast with the inland clearance depots that I believe are going to be ready for opening in January. On the EU side, I've heard quite a lot from the Belgians and from the Dutch, not an awful lot from the French in terms of what their customs authorities and the actual ports authorities are doing and preparing for. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag on the EU side, but I think HMRC are prepared. I think there's still going to be a huge amount of disruption on day one if we Brexit in March, and I think that's why everyone is hoping to move to an interim period.
Okay. I have another question. I think this one's probably best suited for Naushabah. If Parliament continues to vote against the Brexit agreement, is there any alternative to no deal, or is that simply the direction we're headed in, and will that happen in March?
So in terms of, there are a couple of options, but in terms of the deal that goes forward in December, which is when Parliament will have their first meaningful vote, if they then say we're not accepting this, which is likely, then there's a little bit of time for the government to come back and with a slightly different tailored option, which may well be what happens and may well be what passes. However, once say they accept it in December and then a bill goes through, I think the likelihood is that Parliament will accept the bill if they've already agreed to the deal in principle back in December. If they decide that they're not happy with either of the options that Theresa May is putting forward, then yes, the most likely scenario is no deal. However, I think politically there will be a lot of other challenges that happen before we get to that stage. You're more likely to see a change in Prime Minister. You may well see challenges within politics itself from her own party. So there are a number of other options that would potentially be exploited, I think, before a no-deal scenario is finally reached. However, none of that is helpful if you're a business, and it still continues that turmoil. And actually, it doesn't really get to the crux of the problem, which is what does our relationship with the European Union look like? So really, from a business perspective, while a no deal is not what you want to be working towards, being prepared for it is probably the best option at this stage.
Okay. And question, assuming the deal is voted through, should I be stockpiling now, or should I be waiting until the end of the transition period?
My answer to that would be start stockpiling now, but I'll let the others add to that.
I mean, I'll let Richard answer that one, but just from my side, what we are seeing with clients is don't leave it too late to stockpile, because if you can imagine, kind of in March or late February, people are going to really start to ramp up shipments, so things can be quite chaotic in the event that it looks as if we're moving towards a no deal. So I wouldn't leave it too late, depending on the type of goods and whether you're able to store them for a longer period of time. But I'll pass over to Richard for a more full answer.
Yeah, thank you both. Yes, I fundamentally agree. The position that all industries or businesses need to be in now is to be planning. Now that means, in essence, that is planning which are the key components, which are those that are most at risk, which can be held for what length of time, and what supply chains do those components you're purchasing have behind them. So if there are complex engineering components, I'd suggest stockpiling needs to start early, because they physically may not arrive before March, April time. So if they have a long lead time to build. For more simple components, be planning and preparing. And the key is to look at it holistically, is to look at the cost of buying forward those components and the effect on cash flow. It's to look at the storage capabilities, how long can those goods store for and where will they store? And potentially, as Matthew says also, if in a chaotic time, if those goods are in transit for too long, could that have a negative impact on them? And I think also it's to look competitively and to look at which products does each individual business want to have in place in April next year, should no deal come through, and where supplies of goods may be restricted and certainly at least lead times will go up, which are the key to them to maintain their critical relationships and get that balance between cash and sales. I think in the case of a no deal, in the case of of a transition period, the impact should be less. Come April next year, there will still be disruption, but it will be less so, and therefore stockpiling is of less essence. But plan are the top 3 pieces of advice I can give there.
Okay. Another question about staffing. We have a lot of EU staff, both in key roles and also in our warehouses, transport systems, etc. Have you any examples of companies doing a really good job of reassuring those staff about their future in the UK? And if so, have you got specific examples of the kind of things they are doing?
I can probably offer some examples in that. What I have seen is that some of the most successful businesses here have kind of been talking to their staff and giving them information over time. So one of the businesses that we're working with, and it's our HR team that are running this, is they've offered kind of a web portal that can be accessed through the company computers, through an iPad, through a phone, that just provides advice to different people and says, if you're in this situation, this is how we can help. And they're willing to help them with the registration for indefinite leave to remain, and helping them understand what impacts on family members and visa applications. And for certain officials within the business at certain levels, they're actually taking a look at the whole family and doing all the paperwork for that family to put them in the best position that they can be. But I think kind of information is key. Getting the message out to staff that they're wanted, they're integral to the business, that they're supported, that the business will help them get over the line in terms of what they need to do to make sure that they can stay in the UK long term, or to travel for business. There's different scenarios. But I think doing it is absolutely key, and the use of technology in that, I think, is the best way to get that message out to different parts of your business.
So, same question as asked a follow-up on that one. Is that portal open to other companies, or is there a source of information on this that we can leverage to build a similar portal?
So that was actually a specific client example where it's built into the client systems. So everything is the client sending it. So all the content has been provided by us. It's the client that's administrative on that program, sending out the messaging and doing that portal. But I think it's just pulling a lot of the available information that's there. I'm sure the 3 businesses that are on all have their own websites and portals to provide advice on that. But it's distilling that message into something that is specific to your business and your staff profile, and then tailoring that and then pushing it out in the best means, whether that's email, text, web portals, or briefings.
Okay. And a final question, because we're almost out of time. Assuming the current deal is approved, or is approved as amended, as Naushabah said, does that mean that during the transition period, with the exception of the animal products you spoke about, it will be business as usual?
Is that question directed at me? I'm sure the others will have something to add on to this, but yes, on the whole, it does mean that you won't necessarily see the cliff edge that some of the people have been talking about recently, and things are likely to continue as usual. However, the caveat I will put to that is that I think politically, on paper, it will absolutely continue, or it should continue, with the ability to have that transition period as things are. However, politically and socially, there are so many challenges and emotions around this Brexit debate that does cause concern. And I know that there are a number of people in workforces who are from across Europe who necessarily don't feel that the UK is any longer welcoming to them. And I think there are lots of other debates that will be happening within the social sphere that ultimately does have an impact on how this feels. But in terms of transporting goods, the idea is that it should be relatively painless up to a point. The only thing is yes, it gives you another 2 years, but then we're back to the question of what does this look like after we finally leave.
Excellent. Naushabah, Richard, Matthew, thank you for some absolutely terrific information. This has been recorded, and so you will be able to download the webinar and view the webinar. If there's anything you've missed or points you want to go back over. But once again, a huge thank you to our panelists, Naushabah, Richard, and Matthew. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.